Well, hello there, night owls and insomniacs. Welcome back to WTF Dreams, where we dive headfirst into the strangest corners of dream history. Tonight we're exploring something that honestly blew my mind when I first researched it. Doctors throughout history who actually used their patients' dreams to diagnose diseases. I know, right? Like, imagine going to your doctor today and them asking, "So, tell me about your nightmares," instead of checking your blood pressure. So before you settle in with your favorite pillow, and seriously, get comfortable because we're going on a long journey tonight. Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to these bizarre historical tales. And I'm always curious, where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? Drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. It's honestly fascinating to think about all of us scattered across different time zones, all falling asleep to the same weird stories. Tonight we're diving deep into the world of medical dream diagnosis, from ancient Greek temple healers who literally prescribed sleeping in sacred spaces to Victorian alienists who believed your nightmares could reveal everything from tuberculosis too. Well, let's just say they had some very creative theories about what dreams meant. And hey, don't stress if you fall asleep halfway through. That's basically the whole point here. Though I have to warn you, some of these stories are so bizarre you might find yourself accidentally staying awake, just to hear what happens next. You know, there's something weirdly comforting about the fact that people have been having completely bonkers dreams about their health for literally thousands of years. Makes your anxiety dreams about forgetting to wear pants to work seem pretty normal in comparison, doesn't it? Anyway, let's start with what might be the strangest case of dream diagnosis I've ever come across. So picture this. It's around 300 BCE in ancient Greece, and you're feeling absolutely terrible. Your stomach's been killing you for weeks. You've got this persistent cough that sounds like a dying goat, and honestly, you're starting to think you're dying. Maybe you've been throwing up mysterious green stuff, or your joints ache like you've been trampled by a herd of particularly vindictive goats. And let's be real here, Greek medicine at this point was basically, here, chew on this random plant we found behind the temple and pray to whatever god might be listening today. But instead of going to see a regular doctor, who would probably just tell you to balance your humors by bleeding you with leeches while standing on one foot, you decide to visit the temple of Asclepios. And oh boy, this wasn't your typical doctor's office visit where you wait for 3 hours reading your old scrolls about chariot maintenance. Now, this wasn't your typical doctor's office. Oh no. This was basically ancient Greece's version of a medical spa crossed with a psychiatric hospital, crossed with what we'd probably now recognize as a very elaborate placebo treatment center, all run by priests who believed that the god of healing would literally visit you in your dreams and either cure you on the spot or whisper the ancient, equivalent of WebMD diagnoses directly into your sleeping ear. The most famous of these temples was in Epidaurus, which was basically the Mayo Clinic of the ancient world, except with more marble columns and significantly more animal sacrifices. People would travel for weeks to get there, arriving exhausted, sick, and probably wondering if they were completely insane for trusting their lives to dream therapy. The process was, well, it was something else entirely. First, you'd have to purify yourself, which involved ritual baths in water that was probably cleaner than anything you'd bathed in for months. Fasting that would make modern juice cleanses look like all-you-can-eat buffets, and probably sacrificing a rooster or something equally random to prove you were serious about this whole divine healing thing. The priests would examine you, not with medical instruments, but by asking detailed questions about your dreams, your lifestyle, your relationships, and probably your opinion on the current political situation, because ancient Greeks could turn anything into a philosophical discussion. Then, and this is where it gets really weird, you'd be led to this special sleeping chamber called the abaton. Imagine walking down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with stone beds that looked more like ancient operating tables than anything you'd want to sleep on. The air would be thick with incense, frankincense, myrrh, and other expensive aromatics that were supposed to encourage divine visitation, but probably just made everyone slightly loopy from smoke inhalation. You'd hear the sound of other sick people moaning, coughing, shifting around in their sleep, and occasionally crying out in what might have been pain or religious ecstasy. It was hard to tell the difference. The beds themselves were carved from marble and positioned so that you'd be facing a statue of Asclepios, who was depicted as this imposing bearded figure holding a staff with snakes wrapped around it. And yes, this is literally where the medical symbol we still use today comes from, the caduceus. Though technically, Asclepios used a staff with one snake, and Hermes used the two-snake version, but medical accuracy has never been our strong suit, even back then. But here's the kicker, you weren't just supposed to sleep there and hope for the best. Oh no, that would be too simple. You were supposed to have a specific type of dream called an incubation dream, where Asclepios himself would appear to you in all his divine glory. Sometimes he'd perform dream surgery with instruments that gleamed like starlight. Other times he'd whisper the cure in your ear in a voice that sounded like wind through olive trees. And occasionally he'd just point at the part of your body that was causing problems and give you a look that said, "Really? You needed a god to tell you that your liver is the problem when you've been drinking wine like it's water for the past decade." The temple priests, who were called therapeutai, which is literally where we get the word therapy, though I doubt any of them had advanced degrees in psychology, would wake you up in the morning with the ancient equivalent of bedside manner. They'd sit beside your marble bed with clay tablets ready to take notes and be like, "So, what did the god tell you? And please be specific because we need to write this down for our records, and also because the temple's reputation depends on these testimonials." And apparently people would describe these incredibly vivid dreams that were way more detailed and medically specific than you'd expect from people who thought illness was caused by angry gods or imbalanced humors. They described being operated on by a bearded figure who moved with impossible precision, removing tumors from locations they didn't even know were problematic. They dream about being told to stop eating specific foods that we now know can trigger allergic reactions or digestive problems. Some would dream about being given herbal remedies that, when the priests looked them up in their ancient pharmaceutical texts, turned out to be legitimate treatments for their conditions. One documented case that still gives me chills involves a woman named Escanes, who came to the temple suffering from what sounds like ovarian cysts. She'd been in constant pain for months, couldn't eat without vomiting, and was convinced she was dying. The local doctors had told her it was probably demonic possession and suggested she find a good exorcist. But at the temple, she had this incredibly detailed dream where Asclepios appeared to her as a surgeon wearing robes that shifted between white and gold. In the dream, he told her to lie still while he made an incision in her lower abdomen. She could feel everything, the cold touch of his divine scalpel, the strange sensation of his hands moving inside her body, the removal of what felt like dark, twisted growths that writhed like angry serpents. When she woke up, she described the dream to the therapeutai in vivid detail. But here's the weird part. She also woke up with actual physical sensations that corresponded to her dream. Her abdomen felt tender in exactly the spots where Dream Asclepios had made his incisions. Over the next few days, she began passing what the temple records describe as dark, foul-smelling matter that sounds suspiciously like infected cyst material. Within a week, her pain had completely disappeared. She stayed at the temple for another month, gaining weight, regaining her strength, and apparently becoming something of a celebrity patient. The priests used her case as evidence of divine intervention, but modern medical historians who've studied the temple records think she might have had infected ovarian cysts that ruptured naturally, with the dream serving as a kind of psychological preparation for the physical healing process. Now, here's where it gets really interesting from a modern perspective. Researchers have gone through thousands of these ancient dream reports, many of which were carved into stone tablets and are still readable today, and they found some fascinating patterns. The divine diagnoses were often surprisingly accurate for people who had no understanding of anatomy, physiology, or disease processes. People would dream about having tumors removed from specific locations, and when they died years later, because let's be honest, even divine intervention had its limits in the ancient world, autopsies would reveal scar tissue or other evidence of growths in exactly those locations. Others would dream about being told to avoid certain foods, and it would turn out they had allergies or digestive disorders that we now know are triggered by exactly those dietary elements. There's this one case of a soldier who came to the temple with what sounds like PTSD from battle trauma. He'd been having violent nightmares, couldn't sleep, was jumping at every sound, and had developed what the priests called shaking sickness, probably, what we'd now recognize as anxiety-related tremors. In his incubation dream, Asclepios appeared to him not as a healer, but as a fellow warrior. Dream Asclepios sat with him around a campfire and said, "The war is over, soldier. Your body doesn't know this yet, but your mind can teach it." The soldier was told to spend his days at the temple performing specific physical exercises, what sounds like a combination of ancient yoga and military drills, while focusing on peaceful mental imagery. Essentially, the priests had prescribed what we now recognize as exposure therapy combined with mindfulness meditation. The soldier's symptoms gradually improved over several months, and he eventually returned to civilian life. But what really blows my mind is the systematic nature of it all. The priests weren't just randomly interpreting dreams and hoping for the best. They kept detailed records of thousands of cases, cross-referencing dream symbols with medical outcomes over decades. They developed what was essentially a diagnostic manual based on dream imagery. Dreams about snakes usually indicated problems with the nervous system or spine. Dreams about birds often pointed to respiratory issues. Dreams about being eaten by wild animals frequently preceded discoveries of internal parasites or infections. Dreams about drowning or being buried alive almost always indicated heart or lung problems. Dreams about being cut or wounded often revealed hidden injuries or the locations of future surgical interventions. Was it actually divine intervention? Was it some kind of ancient psychosomatic healing that we don't fully understand? Or were these priest doctors way more observant and medically sophisticated than we give them credit for, using the dream incubation process as a way to access their patients' unconscious awareness of their own physical conditions? The honest answer is, nobody really knows. But the success rate was apparently high enough that these temples operated for over 1,000 years, with some remaining active well into the Christian era. That's longer than most modern hospitals have been around, and it's definitely longer than most medical fads survive. What really gets me is imagining being one of those priests, sitting there at dawn with your morning wine, because coffee wouldn't be invented for another 15 centuries, and having some guy stumble out of the sacred sleeping chamber like, "Dude, I just had the weirdest dream. This snake with golden eyes told me I have worms in my intestines, and then it bit my left ankle 3 times before transforming into a beautiful woman who handed me a bowl of bitter herbs." And you'd have to maintain your priestly dignity while thinking, "Yep, that tracks perfectly with our intestinal parasite protocol. And the ankle thing probably means you've got circulation problems. Let me get you some wormwood tea and definitely have someone look at that left leg." The temples were essentially running the world's first systematic program of medical dream interpretation, complete with intake procedures, standardized dream analysis protocols, follow-up care, and outcome tracking. They were doing clinical research 15 centuries before anyone had even conceived of the scientific method. Dreams don't just happen to you. Sometimes they happen through divine intervention with a really sophisticated ancient healthcare system and surprisingly good record keeping. Fast forward to 9th century Baghdad, and we meet this absolutely brilliant physician named al-Razi. Though his full name was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, which is quite a mouthful, so everyone just called him al-Razi, kind of like how we call someone Dr. Smith today. Except infinitely more sophisticated and with significantly better medical knowledge than most doctors would have for the next 1,000 years. This guy was way ahead of his time in ways that would make modern medical professionals weep with envy. He distinguished between smallpox and measles when European doctors were still convinced both diseases were caused by bad air and treated with bloodletting. He performed cataract surgery with instruments so precise they wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room. He basically invented the modern hospital system, complete with medical schools, patient wards organized by condition, and the radical concept that maybe hospitals should be clean places where people go to get better rather than filthy death traps where they go to die more efficiently. But what most people don't know, what doesn't make it into the standard medical history textbooks, is that Al-Razi also wrote extensively about using dreams for medical diagnosis. And this wasn't some mystical, the spirits will reveal all nonsense that you might expect from 9th century medicine. No, this man approached dream diagnosis with the same rigorous scientific methodology he applied to everything else, which was basically revolutionary thinking for an era when most medical treatment involved consulting astrology charts and hoping for the best. Al-Razi had noticed, through years of careful patient observation, that people's dreams often contained surprisingly accurate information about their physical conditions, sometimes revealing problems weeks or even months before any conscious symptoms appeared. But instead of attributing this to divine intervention or supernatural forces, he wanted to figure out exactly how and why this phenomenon worked. He was basically trying to reverse engineer the diagnostic process happening in people's sleeping minds. He documented this one case that still gives me chills when I think about it, both because of how medically precise it was and because of how it demonstrates Al-Razi's incredible observational skills. A wealthy merchant, let's call him Hassan, because that was apparently every third person's name in 9th century Baghdad, came to see him complaining of severe headaches and vision, problems that had been getting progressively worse over several months. Hassan described these headaches as feeling like someone driving iron spikes through my skull from the inside, accompanied by episodes where his vision would suddenly blur or he'd see strange flashing lights that weren't actually there. This was concerning enough, but what really worried Hassan was that the headaches seemed to be affecting his ability to think clearly. He'd find himself losing track of conversations mid-sentence, forgetting the names of business associates he'd known for years, and sometimes feeling confused about where he was or what he was supposed to be doing. Now, Al-Razi's standard examination process was incredibly thorough for the time. He checked Hassan's pulse at multiple points, examined his eyes with magnifying lenses, tested his reflexes, and even had him perform various cognitive tasks to assess his mental function. But the physical examination revealed nothing obviously wrong, no fever, no visible injuries, pupils responded normally to light, no obvious signs of infection or disease. By 9th century standards, Hassan appeared to be a perfectly healthy man who happened to be suffering from mysterious head pain. But Al-Razi had developed the habit of asking all his patients about their dreams as part of his standard intake process, which was pretty unusual for the time. Most doctors considered dreams to be irrelevant distractions at best or signs of spiritual corruption at worst. Al-Razi, however, had started treating dream reports as potentially valuable diagnostic data, filing them away in his incredibly detailed patient records alongside notes about physical symptoms, family history, and lifestyle factors. When Al-Razi asked Hassan about his dreams, the merchant's response was immediate and specific. For the past several months, Hassan had been having the same recurring nightmare almost every single night. In these dreams, he was working in his shop, conducting normal business, when suddenly someone would appear behind him and start hitting him in the head with a large iron hammer. But here's the part that made Al-Razi pay very close attention. In every single dream, the hammer struck the exact same spot on the left side of Hassan's skull, just above and slightly behind his left ear. And in these dreams, Hassan could actually see inside his own head. He described watching his brain pulsing like a wounded animal with each hammer blow, with dark liquid seeping out around the edges. The dreams were so vivid and disturbing that Hassan had started avoiding sleep, which was making his daytime symptoms even worse. He'd lie awake for hours, dreading the moment he'd drift off and the nightmare would begin again. When he did finally fall asleep from exhaustion, he'd wake up feeling like the dream hammer blows had actually happened, with throbbing pain in exactly the same location where Dream Hassan had been struck. Now, most doctors of Al-Razi's era would have heard this dream report and either dismissed it as irrelevant fantasy or interpreted it as evidence of demonic possession requiring spiritual intervention. But Al-Razi had trained himself to look for patterns and connections that others missed. The fact that Hassan's dream consistently targeted the same specific location on his skull, combined with his waking symptoms of headaches and cognitive problems, suggested to al-Razi that there might be a real physical problem in exactly that area. So al-Razi did something that was quite remarkable for 9th century medicine. He conducted an incredibly detailed physical examination of the exact spot on Hassan's head that appeared in the dreams. Using his fingertips, magnifying lenses, and various instruments, he carefully examined every inch of Hassan's skull in the area where the dream hammer had been striking. And there was a small, barely detectable depression in the skull bone, so subtle that it would have been easy to miss unless you were looking for exactly that kind of abnormality in exactly that location. The depression was roughly circular, about the size of a small coin. And when al-Razi pressed gently on the area, Hassan immediately reported that it reproduced the exact type of pain he'd been experiencing in his waking headaches. Al-Razi's medical notes from this case, which still exist in translated form, show his reasoning process. He theorized that Hassan had suffered some kind of skull injury years earlier, probably in childhood, since Hassan couldn't remember any recent head trauma that had healed over but left the bone slightly weakened and deformed. Over time, the normal pressure changes that occur in the skull had begun to create problems in that weakened area, causing both the headaches and the cognitive symptoms. But here's the really fascinating part. Al-Razi believed that Hassan's brain was somehow aware of this structural problem and was trying to communicate that awareness through the dream imagery. The hammer in the dreams wasn't random symbolism. It was Hassan's unconscious mind's way of showing him exactly where the problem was located and what kind of structural damage was occurring. Al-Razi's treatment approach was as innovative as his diagnosis. He performed a small surgical procedure to relieve the pressure in the affected area of Hassan's skull, essentially an early form of cranial surgery that involved carefully removing a small section of the damaged bone and replacing it with a metal plate. This was incredibly advanced surgery for the 9th century, requiring precise anatomical knowledge and surgical skills that wouldn't become common in Europe for several more centuries. The results were apparently dramatic. Within days of the surgery, Hassan's headaches disappeared completely, his vision problems resolved, and his cognitive function returned to normal. But perhaps most remarkably, the recurring nightmares about being struck with a hammer also stopped entirely. Hassan reported that for the first time in months, he was able to sleep peacefully through the night without fear of the dream hammer returning. But al-Razi didn't stop there. This case got him thinking systematically about the relationship between dream content and physical health, so he started documenting similar cases with obsessive thoroughness. His medical journals, which were revolutionary for their time in terms of detail and systematic organization, contain hundreds of cases where patients' dreams provided crucial diagnostic information that physical examination had missed. He documented people dreaming about snakes biting specific limbs, and those limbs turning out to have circulation problems or nerve damage that wasn't yet causing conscious symptoms. Patients having dreams about drowning or being unable to breathe, and subsequent examination revealing early signs of lung disease or heart problems. Dreams about being burned, and the dreamer having hidden fevers or infections that standard examination techniques couldn't detect. One particularly fascinating case involved a young woman who came to al-Razi complaining of fatigue and occasional dizzy spells. Physical examination revealed nothing abnormal, and by 9th century standards, she appeared to be a healthy young woman suffering from what we might now call stress or anxiety. But when al-Razi asked about her dreams, she described having recurring nightmares about bleeding from wounds that wouldn't heal, with blood that was darker than night and thick like honey. Based on this dream report, al-Razi suspected some kind of blood disorder and began monitoring the woman's condition more closely. Over the following weeks, she developed symptoms of what we now recognize as a severe form of anemia. Al-Razi's early intervention, based primarily on her dream reports, probably saved her life. Through cases like these, al-Razi developed a comprehensive theory about the relationship between unconscious bodily awareness and dream content. He wrote that the body's knowledge of itself exceeds the mind's ability to perceive, and that dreams served as a pathway for this hidden knowledge to reach conscious awareness. He theorized that every organ in the body had its own way of speaking through dreams when something was wrong. Heart problems often manifested as dreams about being chased or about the chest being crushed. Liver problems frequently appeared in dreams as bitter tastes, yellow colors, or feelings of nausea. Kidney problems often showed up as dreams about drowning or being unable to urinate. Brain problems, like Hassan's case, typically involved dreams about the head being attacked or damaged. Al-Razi even developed a classification system for different types of medical dreams, organizing them by body system, symptom type, and probable underlying conditions. He created what was essentially the world's first systematic manual for medical dream interpretation, complete with detailed case studies, outcome data, and treatment recommendations based on specific dream patterns. What I find absolutely remarkable about Al-Razi is that he treated these dream reports as valuable diagnostic data while maintaining a completely rational, non-supernatural approach to medicine. He didn't attribute the dreams to divine intervention or mystical forces. Instead, he developed what was essentially an early theory of psychosomatic medicine, the idea that the mind and body are intimately connected, and that physical problems can express themselves through psychological symptoms, including dreams. He wrote, "The sleeping mind perceives what the waking mind cannot detect, not through magic or divine inspiration, but through the natural sensitivity of the body's own awareness of its condition." This was incredibly advanced thinking for the 9th century, the recognition that consciousness might not be the most sensitive tool for monitoring physical health, and that the unconscious mind might have access to medical information that conscious examination couldn't reveal. Can you imagine going to your doctor today and having them say, "Okay, I've done the physical exam and run some tests, but now I need you to tell me about any unusual dreams you've been having lately"? We'd probably think they'd lost their medical license. But Al-Razi was essentially practicing a form of integrated, mind-body medicine that was about 1,000 years ahead of its time. The really incredible part is that modern sleep medicine and neuroscience have actually validated many of Al-Razi's observations. We now know that the brain regions responsible for monitoring bodily functions are highly active during sleep, and that physical problems often do influence dream content in predictable ways. People with sleep apnea consistently dream about suffocating. Diabetics often have dreams about extreme thirst or food before their blood sugar becomes problematic. People with heart problems frequently dream about being chased or having their chest compressed. Al-Razi figured all of this out using nothing but careful observation, detailed record keeping, and a willingness to consider that dreams might contain medically relevant information. He was basically practicing evidence-based medicine in an era when most medical treatment was based on superstition, tradition, and wild guesswork. Sometimes the most advanced diagnostic tool isn't a machine or a test. It's just a doctor who's willing to listen to what the patient's unconscious mind is trying to say. Okay, so we jump ahead to 1830s Scotland, and we meet Dr. Robert McNish, who was basically the Victorian era's answer to, well, I guess a combination of Freud, House, M.D., and Sherlock Holmes, but with more laudanum addiction, significantly less understanding of how brains actually work, and a disturbing fascination with what he called the nocturnal manifestations of corporeal distress, which is basically Victorian speak for people's nightmares can tell you what's wrong with their bodies, though they had to use at least 12 syllables to say what we could express in 6 words. Doctor. McNish wrote this absolutely massive book called The Philosophy of Sleep. And when I say massive, I mean this thing was like 400 pages of dense Victorian prose about dreams, nightmares, sleepwalking, and what he delicately referred to as the morbid phenomena of nocturnal consciousness. Reading it today is like wading through intellectual molasses, but hidden within all that flowery language are some genuinely fascinating observations about the connection between dreams and physical health. Now, McNish was working during this incredibly weird period in medical history when doctors were just starting to understand that the brain and body might be connected in complex ways, but they still believed that women's ovaries could cause mental illness, that masturbation would make you blind and insane, and that most diseases were caused by moral weakness or insufficient exposure to fresh air. so you have to take his theories with a pretty large grain of salt. But the guy was remarkably observant when it came to documenting patterns in his patients' dream reports. He had this theory about what he called pathological somnambulism, basically. The idea that you could use people's dreams and sleep behaviors to diagnose everything from brain tumors to what the Victorians delicately called female hysteria. Though their definition of female hysteria was so broad it basically included any woman who expressed an opinion about anything. Victorian medicine was not great when it came to understanding women's health, to put it mildly. But here's the thing about Macnish. Despite working within the somewhat questionable medical framework of his era, he was remarkably systematic in his approach to dream analysis. He kept incredibly detailed patient records, documented outcomes over months and years, and actually tried to test his theories by following up with patients to see if his dream-based diagnoses turned out to be accurate. This was pretty revolutionary thinking for an era when most doctors just prescribed laudanum for everything and hoped for the best. He documented this one case that still sounds absolutely incredible today, both for its medical accuracy and for how it demonstrates the strange precision that dreams can sometimes have when it comes to revealing hidden physical problems. A young woman, let's call her Margaret, since that was apparently the most popular name for Victorian women who appeared in medical case, studies came to see him in what was clearly a state of severe psychological distress. Margaret was 23 years old, unmarried, which was considered somewhat suspicious by Victorian standards, and worked as a governess for a wealthy family in Edinburgh. She'd been experiencing what we'd probably now recognize as severe depression for several months. She'd lost her appetite completely and had dropped what sounds like a dangerous amount of weight. She couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time, and when she did manage to fall asleep, she'd wake up feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed. She was constantly tired during the day but couldn't rest at night, had started having trouble concentrating on her work, and had developed what she described as a persistent feeling that something terrible is about to happen, though I cannot say what. Her employers had become concerned because Margaret, who had previously been an excellent governess, was making mistakes in her work, seeming distracted and distant with the children, and occasionally bursting into tears for no apparent reason. They'd initially assumed she was suffering from disappointment in love, the Victorian catch-all explanation for any emotional distress in young women, but when her condition didn't improve after several months, they'd grown worried enough to pay for her to see a physician. Margaret's family had become convinced she was losing her mind and were seriously considering having her committed to an asylum, which in 1830s Scotland was basically a death sentence disguised as medical treatment. Asylums of that era were horrific places where people were chained to walls, beaten regularly, and subjected to treatments, like being spun in rotating chairs until they vomited or having ice water poured on their heads for hours at a time. Now, most Victorian doctors would have taken one look at Margaret, young woman, unmarried, exhibiting emotional distress, and immediately diagnosed hysteria without bothering to dig any deeper. The standard treatment would have been rest, isolation from stimulating influences, and possibly removal of her ovaries, because Victorians were convinced that women's reproductive organs were the source of most psychological problems. One wish I were making this up, but ovary removal was a standard treatment for female madness in the 1830s. But Macnish, to his credit, had developed the unusual habit of actually listening to what his patients told him instead of just immediately prescribing whatever treatment was fashionable that week. And when he asked Margaret to describe her symptoms in detail, what she told him about her dreams made him think there might be something more serious going on than simple hysteria. Margaret explained that for the past several months, she'd been having the same terrifying nightmare almost every single night. In these dreams, she was lying in a coffin, but she wasn't dead. She was fully conscious, aware of everything happening around her, but completely unable to move or speak. She could hear people talking about her, making funeral arrangements, discussing how young she was to die, and what a tragedy it was that she'd never had the chance to marry and have children. But the most disturbing part of these dreams, the part that would wake her up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, was that she could feel something moving around inside her chest. She described it as a dark creature with many legs, like a spider but larger, crawling around inside my lungs and eating me from the inside out. In the dreams, she could actually see this creature, sometimes writhing and moving beneath her skin, growing larger each night. The dreams were so vivid and so consistently terrifying that Margaret had started avoiding sleep altogether, which was making her daytime symptoms even worse. She'd lie awake for hours, dreading the moment she'd drift off and find herself back in that coffin with the creature eating her alive from within. Now, most Victorian doctors would have heard young woman having morbid dreams about death and creatures inside her body, and immediately concluded that she was suffering from hysteria, possibly brought on by reading too many Gothic novels or thinking too much about inappropriate subjects. The prescription would have been complete rest, removal from all intellectual stimulation, and possibly confinement to prevent her from exciting her already overwrought feminine constitution. But McNish had noticed something that made him think there might be more to Margaret's case than psychological distress. Throughout their conversation, she kept unconsciously touching the same spot on her chest when she described the dreams, always the same location, always with this unconscious gesture where she'd press her hand against her ribcage just below her left breast. It was subtle, probably something she wasn't even aware she was doing, but McNish had trained himself to notice these kinds of physical behaviors. So instead of immediately diagnosing hysteria and prescribing bed rest, McNish asked Margaret to remove her dress so he could conduct a thorough physical examination of her chest area. This was pretty unusual for the time. Victorian doctors were often reluctant to physically examine female patients, especially unmarried women, and many diagnoses were made based purely on reported symptoms rather than hands-on examination. When McNish examined the area where Margaret had been unconsciously touching, he found something that made his blood run cold. A small, hard lump, roughly the size of a walnut, located just beneath the skin. The lump was firm, irregular in shape, and seemed to be attached to the underlying tissue. When he pressed on it gently, Margaret immediately said that it reproduced the exact sensation she experienced in her dreams, the feeling of something moving and growing inside her chest. This was 1834, remember, decades before we understood much about cancer, before X-rays, before most of the diagnostic tools we take for granted today. But McNish had seen enough cases to suspect that Margaret's lump was probably what we'd now recognize as a malignant tumor. And what absolutely terrified him was the possibility that Margaret's dreams had been accurately describing the growth and spread of this cancer for months, possibly before it became large enough to detect through physical examination. McNish documented that over the following months, as Margaret's tumor grew larger and more obvious, her dreams became even more vivid and more medically specific. She started dreaming about the exact size and shape of the growth, describing it as a dark creature with tentacles spreading like tree roots through my chest, reaching toward my heart and lungs. When she eventually died about 8 months later, because 1830s, cancer treatment was basically non-existent, the autopsy revealed a tumor that matched her dream descriptions with terrifying accuracy. The tumor had indeed spread in exactly the pattern Margaret had been dreaming about, with what pathologists now call invasive projections extending toward her heart and lungs. The size, shape, and location of the cancer corresponded almost perfectly to the creature she'd been seeing in her nightmares for months before her death. But McNish didn't stop there. This case got him thinking systematically about the relationship between dream content and physical disease, so he started paying obsessive attention to all his patients' dreams and looking for patterns that others had missed. What he discovered was fascinating and more than a little disturbing. He found that people with kidney stones almost invariably had dreams about swallowing rocks, pebbles, or other hard objects that they couldn't digest. Patients with heart problems consistently reported dreams about their chest being crushed, compressed, or attacked by heavy animals. People with undiagnosed diabetes frequently had recurring dreams about being unbearably thirsty, drinking enormous quantities of water that never satisfied their thirst, or being surrounded by sweet foods they desperately wanted but couldn't reach. One case that particularly fascinated McNish involved a middle-aged businessman who came to him complaining of occasional dizzy spells and what he described as a general feeling of unwellness. Physical examination revealed nothing obviously wrong, but when McNish asked about the man's dreams, he described having recurring nightmares about his head being filled with water that sloshed around when he moved, making him feel off balance and nauseated. Based on these dream reports, McNish suspected some kind of inner ear problem and referred the man to a specialist. Sure enough, examination revealed a chronic ear infection that was affecting the man's balance and causing the dizziness he'd been experiencing. Treatment of the infection resolved both the physical symptoms and the dreams about water sloshing around in his head. McNish developed this theory that what he called the sleeping mind had access to information about the body's condition that the waking consciousness couldn't perceive. He believed that during sleep, the mind somehow gained the ability to sense internal physical problems and translate that awareness into symbolic dream imagery. Essentially, he thought dreams were like having a really morbid but remarkably accurate diagnostic tool that spoke exclusively in metaphors and symbols. He wrote, "The dreams of the diseased are often prophetic of their corporeal condition, revealing through symbolic representation those morbid processes which have not yet manifested themselves to conscious perception." Which is Victorian speak for people's nightmares can tell you what's wrong with them before they even know they're sick. The weird thing is, from a modern medical perspective, McNish was actually onto something important. Current research has shown that our brains are constantly monitoring our body's condition, processing vast amounts of sensory information about internal states, immune responses, hormonal changes, and tissue health. Most of this monitoring happens below the level of conscious awareness, but it can definitely influence our dreams, especially during periods when our immune systems are fighting off infections or when tumors are beginning to develop. People with sleep apnea often dream about suffocating long before they're consciously aware of breathing problems. Diabetics frequently have dreams about food, thirst, or sweetness before their blood sugar levels become obviously problematic. Cancer patients sometimes report dreams about being invaded, attacked, or eaten by creatures or parasites months before their tumors are large enough to be detected through standard examination. McNish even developed what he called dream diagnosis protocols. Basically, a systematic way of interpreting common dream symbols as potential indicators of specific health conditions. Dreams about drowning or suffocating usually pointed to respiratory or heart problems. Dreams about being burned or attacked by fire often indicated fever or infection. Dreams about being crushed or squeezed typically suggested problems with internal organs being compressed by tumors or other growths. He created what was essentially an early version of a medical dream interpretation manual, complete with detailed case studies, outcome data, and treatment recommendations based on specific dream patterns. It was like a Victorian-era WebMD, but with significantly more gothic horror imagery and, weirdly, more accurate diagnostic results than most other medical tools of the time. What I find absolutely fascinating about McNish is that he managed to develop a genuinely useful diagnostic technique while working within the completely bonkers medical framework of Victorian Scotland. He was operating in an era when doctors thought mental illness was caused by moral weakness, when women's health problems were automatically attributed to their reproductive organs, and when the standard treatment for most conditions was either bloodletting or laudanum. But somehow, within all that medical nonsense, he figured out that people's dreams contained valuable information about their physical health. The Victorians might not have understood germs, hormones, or how cancer actually works, but they definitely understood that the human mind has a really dramatic and surprisingly accurate way of trying to get your attention when something's seriously wrong. Let's travel back to 1665 London, right in the middle of the Great Plague. And honestly, if you think 2020 was rough with COVID lockdowns and mask mandates, imagine living through a pandemic where the official medical advice was pray harder, avoid bad smells, and maybe carry some herbs in your pocket to ward off evil humors. Picture this absolute nightmare scenario. People are dying left and right at a rate that makes modern pandemics look like minor inconveniences. Nobody really understands what's causing it beyond vague theories about miasmatic vapors and God's wrath. Dead bodies are being carted through the streets daily, and the city's basically turned into a giant open-air morgue where the living and the dead exist in this horrifying proximity that would make modern epidemiologists have nervous breakdowns. And in the middle of all this chaos, there's Dr. Thomas Sydenham, who would later be called the English Hippocrates, though at the time, he was just another overwhelmed physician frantically trying to figure out how to identify plague cases, before people became obviously symptomatic and started the whole dying process. Sydenham was working with basically no understanding of how infectious diseases actually spread, no antibiotics, no real treatments beyond bleeding people and hoping for divine intervention, and certainly no concept of bacteria, viruses, or how immune systems work. Now, the obvious symptoms of plague are, well, they're pretty hard to miss and also pretty much universally fatal once they appear. We're talking about the infamous buboes, those charming swollen lymph nodes that could grow to the size of apples and were often accompanied by black, necrotic skin that earned the disease its cheerful nickname of Black Death. Then there's the high fever that would leave people delirious and hallucinating, violent vomiting that often included blood, and generally looking like death warmed over and then cooled down again for good measure. But here's the terrifying catch-22 that Sydenham was dealing with. By the time someone showed those obvious symptoms, they were usually past the point of no return medically, and they'd already been walking around London for days or weeks, breathing on people, touching things, and basically serving as highly efficient plague distribution systems. The disease had an incubation period where people were contagious but didn't look obviously sick, which meant that by the time you identified one plague case, there were probably dozens of new infections already spreading through the city. Sydenham was desperately trying to find some way to identify plague cases earlier in the disease process, before people reached the obviously dying of plague stage. He was basically trying to solve the same problem that modern epidemiologists face during disease: outbreaks. How do you catch cases early enough to prevent transmission while also avoiding the panic that comes from false positives? But then Sydenham started noticing something really weird. In the weeks before the plague really exploded across London, when the official death toll was still relatively low and city officials were still insisting that everything was under control, he started seeing patients who were complaining about intensely vivid nightmares. And these weren't just your garden variety anxiety dreams about the world ending, which would have been pretty reasonable given that the world did seem to be ending and people were understandably stressed about that possibility. No, these were very specific dreams with remarkably consistent imagery across different patients, who hadn't talked to each other and had no obvious connection beyond living in the same plague-ravaged city. People were coming to Sydenham describing dreams about being eaten alive by rats, not just chased by rats or seeing rats, but actually being consumed by enormous swarms of rats that would start at their feet and work their way up, methodically devouring them while they were still conscious and aware of every bite. Others described dreams about black smoke pouring out of their mouths every time they tried to speak, with the smoke being so thick and choking that they'd wake up gasping for air. Some had recurring nightmares about their bodies being covered in dark spots that moved and writhed under their skin like living things, spreading across their limbs and torso until they covered every inch of their body. At first, Sydenham assumed these were just anxiety dreams. I mean, the whole city was basically having a collective nervous breakdown, and it would have been weirder if people weren't having disturbing dreams about death and disease. London in 1665 was not a place that promoted restful sleep and pleasant dreams. The streets smelled like death. There were bodies being carted away daily, and everyone was living in constant fear of becoming the next victim. But then Sydenham started noticing a pattern that made his blood run cold. Almost everyone who came to him describing these specific types of nightmares, the rats, the black smoke, the moving spots, ended up developing actual plague symptoms within a week or two of reporting the dreams. And I'm talking about a really high correlation rate. Like 80 to 90% of people who had these particular dreams eventually got sick with what was unmistakably plague. This was not a small sample size we're talking about. Sydenham was one of the busiest physicians in London during the plague years, seeing dozens of patients every day, and he started keeping obsessive records of who reported what kinds of dreams and what happened to them subsequently. His medical notes from this period, which still exist in various archives, show him tracking dream reports with the same systematic attention he gave to physical symptoms. So Sydenham, being the practical and somewhat desperate guy he was, started using dream reports as an early warning system for plague infection. If someone came to him saying they'd been having recurring nightmares about rats eating them alive or black smoke pouring from their mouths, he'd immediately start them on what passed for preventive treatment at the time. This mostly consisted of isolation from other people, consumption of large quantities of wine, which was thought to purify the blood, and various herbal remedies that probably didn't do much medically, but at least kept people busy and hopeful. He documented this one case that still gives me chills when I think about it, both for how accurately the dream predicted the subsequent illness and for how it demonstrates the strange precision that these plague dreams could have. A wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitmore came to see Sydenham in apparently perfect health, complaining only that he'd been having the same nightmare every single night for about a week. In the dream, Whitmore was hosting a dinner party at his house, entertaining important business associates and potential investors. Everything seemed normal at first. Good food, wine, conversation about trade opportunities and political developments. But then, every time Whitmore tried to eat anything, every piece of food he put in his mouth would immediately transform into live rats that would start gnawing at his throat from the inside. He could feel them clawing and biting as they made their way down his throat, and he'd try to cough them up or spit them out. But more food would keep turning into more rats until his mouth and throat were full of these writhing, scratching creatures. The other dinner guests would continue eating and talking as if nothing was wrong, even as Whitmore was choking and gagging on rats that were eating him from within. The dream was so vivid and so consistently terrifying that Whitmore had stopped eating regular meals, surviving on liquids and small amounts of bread because he was afraid that real food might somehow transform into rats like in his dreams. He'd lost weight, wasn't sleeping well, and was starting to avoid social situations because he was afraid the nightmare might somehow become reality. Sydenham immediately told Whitmore to quarantine himself at home, avoid contact with other people, and sent word to everyone the merchant had been in contact with during the previous week, warning them to watch for plague symptoms. This was pretty radical advice to give to someone who appeared perfectly healthy, and Whitmore initially resisted because it would mean missing important business meetings and potentially losing money. But Sydenham had learned to take these specific types of dreams very seriously, so he basically scared Whitmore into compliance by describing what had happened to other patients who'd had similar rat-eating dreams and then ignored medical advice. Whitmore reluctantly agreed to isolate himself, though he complained bitterly about the inconvenience and expense. Sure enough, within 5 days, Whitmore developed a fever and the beginnings of what would become classic plague symptoms. But here's the remarkable part. Because Sydenham had caught the infection so early and started treatment immediately, and because Whitmore had been isolated and wasn't spreading the disease to others, the merchant actually survived. This was practically miraculous given that the plague had something like a 60% mortality rate, and most people who developed obvious symptoms were dead within a week. Word spread pretty quickly through London's tight-knit community about Dr. Sydenham's dream diagnosis method, and people started coming to him specifically to have their nightmares interpreted. He essentially became London's plague fortune teller, except instead of reading tea leaves or crystal balls, he was reading people's subconscious fears about their own mortality and using that information to make life-or-death medical decisions. Sydenham developed what was essentially a classification system for plague-predictive dreams. Dreams about being eaten by rats or other vermin almost always indicated someone in the early stages of bubonic plague. Dreams about black smoke, choking, or being unable to breathe usually meant the person was developing the pneumonic form of plague, which affected the lungs and was even more deadly than the standard bubonic version. Dreams about dark spots or creatures moving under the skin typically predicted the hemorrhagic form of plague, where people would develop internal bleeding and often die within hours of symptom onset. He documented dozens of cases where his dream-based early intervention saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. People who might have continued going about their daily business, infecting others and eventually dying themselves, were instead caught early and isolated before they could spread the disease further. Sydenham's patient survival rate during the plague years was significantly higher than most physicians of his era, largely because he'd figured out how to identify cases before they became critical. But what makes this even more remarkable is that Sydenham didn't really understand why his method worked. He just knew that people's nightmares seemed to predict illness with uncanny accuracy, so he used that information. He theorized that maybe people's souls could somehow sense approaching death and tried to warn the conscious mind through dreams, or that perhaps God was sending warnings through dreams to those who were destined to survive if they heeded the signs. From a modern medical perspective, what Sydenham had stumbled onto was the phenomenon of prodromal symptoms, early signs of illness that occur before the disease becomes clinically obvious. We now know that the immune system can detect infections days or even weeks before there are any conscious symptoms, and that this early immune response can definitely affect brain chemistry, sleep patterns, and dream content. During the early stages of plague infection, when bacteria are beginning to multiply in the lymph nodes and bloodstream, the immune system starts producing inflammatory responses that can affect the central nervous system. These inflammatory chemicals can cross the blood-brain barrier and influence the parts of the brain responsible for sleep, dreaming, and emotional processing. People in the early stages of plague infection would have been experiencing subtle changes in their brain, chemistry that could easily manifest as unusually vivid or disturbing dreams. The specific imagery of the dreams, rats, smoke, creatures under the skin, probably reflected both cultural associations with disease and death, and also the body's unconscious awareness of what was happening internally. Rats were associated with plague because people had noticed the connection between rat die-offs and human disease outbreaks. Black smoke might have represented the body's awareness of developing respiratory problems. Creatures under the skin could have been the unconscious mind's way of representing the bacterial infection spreading through the lymphatic system. But Sydenham didn't know any of that. He just knew that people who had certain types of nightmares were likely to get sick, and that early intervention could save lives. He was basically crowdsourcing early disease detection through nightmare analysis in 1665 without understanding anything about how it actually worked. What's really incredible is that his method was probably more effective at preventing plague transmission than most of the official public health measures of the time. The city authorities were focused on things like burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, closing theaters and taverns, and killing cats and dogs because they thought pets might spread the disease. Meanwhile, Sydenham was actually identifying infectious people before they became obviously symptomatic, and getting them isolated before they could spread the plague to others. He essentially developed an early warning system for plague outbreaks based entirely on listening to people's dreams and taking their nightmares seriously as medical data. It was like having a really macabre but surprisingly accurate diagnostic tool that operated through the collective unconscious of plague-infected London. Sometimes the most advanced medical technique available is just paying attention to what people are trying to tell you, even when they're unconscious and speaking in the symbolic language of nightmares. Our final main story takes us to 1918 Boston, during what was probably the most devastating pandemic in modern human history, the Spanish flu outbreak that killed more people than World War I and fundamentally changed how we think about infectious disease and public health. And right in the middle of this medical catastrophe, we meet Dr. Eleanor Morrison, who was already breaking all kinds of barriers just by existing as a female doctor in 1980 in America, where women had only recently gotten the right to vote and were still considered intellectually inferior to men. By most of the medical establishment, Dr. Morrison was working at Boston City Hospital, which had been transformed from a regular medical facility into basically a massive emergency triage center where people were dying faster than the morgues could process bodies. The Spanish flu was particularly nasty because it had this horrifying tendency to kill people who should have been healthy, young adults in their 20s and 30s, people in their physical prime who should have been able to fight off a respiratory infection, but instead were dying within hours or days of developing symptoms. The speed of death was what made the Spanish flu so terrifying for medical professionals. Someone could wake up in the morning feeling perfectly fine, develop a slight cough by lunch, be running a high fever by dinner, and be dead before sunrise the next day. The medical community was completely overwhelmed and had absolutely no idea how to predict who would survive and who would die, which made it impossible to allocate the limited medical resources effectively. Most hospitals were operating on a kind of medical triage system where they basically had to guess which patients were worth spending time and resources on, and which ones were probably going to die no matter what anyone did. It was a horrible situation that forced doctors to make life and death decisions based on incomplete information and educated guesses. But Dr. Morrison noticed something that other doctors were dismissing as medically irrelevant. Her patients' dreams changed dramatically in the 24 to 48 hours before they took a turn for the worse. And I'm not talking about just having bad dreams about being sick or dying. That would have been completely understandable given the circumstances. We're talking about very specific, very weird dream patterns that seem to predict exactly how each patient's illness would progress. Morrison had developed the habit of asking all her patients about their dreams as part of her intake process, which was pretty unusual for the time. Most doctors considered dream reports to be either irrelevant distractions from real medical symptoms, or signs of delirium that indicated the patient was already too far gone to save. But Morrison had noticed that patients often reported significant changes in their dream patterns before showing any obvious changes in their physical condition. Patients who were going to develop pneumonia, which is what actually killed most Spanish flu victims, would start having dreams about drowning. But these weren't just generic drowning dreams. They were incredibly specific. Patients described drowning in thick black water that they said felt heavy as tar or like drowning in oil. They'd wake up feeling like they couldn't breathe, even though their lungs still sounded clear on examination and their oxygen levels appeared normal. These drowning dreams were so consistent and so vivid that Morrison started using them as an early warning sign for pneumonia development. When a patient reported having dreams about drowning in thick, dark liquid, she'd immediately move them to the respiratory care ward and start aggressive treatment for lung complications. Even if their breathing seemed fine, people who were going to develop the neurological complications. BECAUSE Spanish flu could cross the blood-brain barrier and cause brain inflammation, seizures, and sometimes permanent neurological damage. Would have dreams about being lost in mazes or about their thoughts being stolen by invisible thieves. They'd describe dreams where they were trying to remember important information, but every time they tried to access a memory, it would disappear or transform into something completely different. One patient described recurring dreams where he was trying to write a letter to his wife, but every time he looked down at the paper, the words he'd written had changed into symbols he couldn't understand. Another reported dreams about being in conversations where people were speaking English, but the words meant completely different things than they should, as if someone had secretly changed the definition of every word in the language. Morrison documented that patients who had these confusion dreams almost always went on to develop what she called brain fever, high temperatures combined with delirium, confusion, and sometimes seizures. By recognizing the early warning signs in dream reports, she could start treating the neurological complications before they became life-threatening. Patients destined for hemorrhagic complications, internal bleeding that could be fatal within hours, would dream about rivers of blood or about bleeding from wounds that wouldn't heal. But again, these weren't just generic anxiety dreams about blood. Patients would describe very specific dreams about bleeding from their noses, mouths, or ears, often days before they showed any signs of actual hemorrhaging. Morrison documented this one case that perfectly illustrates how eerily accurate and medically specific these predictive dreams could be. A 22-year-old teacher named Sarah Collins came to the hospital with what seemed like relatively mild flu symptoms, just a low fever. some body aches and general fatigue. Nothing that seemed particularly serious compared to the severe cases Morrison was seeing every day. Sarah was conscious, alert, able to walk and talk normally, and her vital signs were stable. By 1918 medical standards, she seemed like exactly the kind of patient who would recover with rest and supportive care. Morrison almost discharged her with instructions to go home, rest, and return if her symptoms got worse. But Morrison had made it her practice to ask every patient about their recent dreams, so she asked Sarah if she'd been having any unusual dreams since getting sick. Sarah's response made Morrison immediately change her treatment plan. For 3 nights in a row, Sarah had been having the same incredibly vivid and disturbing nightmare. In the dream, she was teaching her usual class of 8-year-olds, standing at the front of the classroom with chalk in her hand, trying to explain a mathematics lesson on the blackboard. Everything seemed normal at first. The children were sitting quietly at their desks, paying attention, occasionally raising their hands to ask questions. But then, every time Sarah tried to speak, instead of words coming out of her mouth, thick black water would pour out like a waterfall. Not just a trickle or a small amount. We're talking about gallons of this dark, oily water gushing from her mouth every time she opened it to speak. The water would splash onto the floor, spreading across the classroom, and the children would start screaming and running toward the exits, trying to escape the flood. Sarah would try to stop the flow, pressing her hands over her mouth, but the water would just find other ways out, pouring from her nose, her ears, even her eyes. The more she tried to speak or call for help, the more water would come out, until the entire classroom was flooded and she was drowning in the same black water that had been pouring from her body. She'd wake up gasping for air, her heart pounding, feeling like she'd actually been drowning. The dream was so vivid and so terrifying that she'd started avoiding sleep, which was making her daytime symptoms worse. Based on this dream report alone, Morrison immediately moved Sarah to the critical care ward and started aggressive treatment for pneumonia. Even though Sarah's lungs still sounded completely clear on examination and she showed no obvious signs of respiratory distress. The other doctors thought Morrison had lost her mind. Why waste precious critical care resources on a patient who seemed relatively stable when there were so many obviously sicker patients who needed attention? But Morrison had learned to trust these predictive dreams, even when they contradicted physical examination findings. She started Sarah on the strongest treatments available for respiratory complications: oxygen therapy, chest percussion to clear fluid from the lungs, and careful monitoring of her breathing and oxygen levels. 12 hours later, Sarah's condition changed dramatically. She developed severe pneumonia almost exactly as Morrison had predicted based on the drowning dreams. Her lungs filled with fluid, her oxygen levels dropped dangerously low, and she began showing all the signs of the respiratory that was killing most Spanish flu patients. But because Morrison had caught the complication early and started treatment immediately, before Sarah's lungs were completely compromised, she was able to provide the aggressive supportive care that saved Sarah's life. Sarah survived the Spanish flu, which was pretty remarkable given that the pandemic killed over 50 million people worldwide, including a disproportionate number of healthy young adults exactly like her. Morrison tried to publish her findings about dream-based early detection of Spanish flu complications, but the medical establishment basically laughed her out of the room. Here was this woman, doctor, already suspect in the eyes of her male colleagues, suggesting that nightmares could predict medical outcomes better than physical examination and laboratory tests. The entirely male medical community's response was essentially, "That's not science. That's superstition, and it's exactly the kind of irrational thinking we'd expect from a female physician." Medical journals refused to publish her papers about dream-based diagnosis. Hospital administrators questioned her judgment and suggested that maybe she wasn't emotionally stable enough to handle the stress of pandemic medicine. Some of her male colleagues openly speculated that Dr. Morrison was having some kind of nervous breakdown and should perhaps take a leave of absence until she could think more rationally about medical practice. But Morrison kept using her dream analysis method anyway, because it was saving lives and she could see the results in her patient outcomes. Her survival rate for Spanish flu patients was significantly higher than other doctors treating similar cases. She was catching pneumonia, neurological complications, and hemorrhagic problems days before other physicians, which gave her patients a crucial advantage in terms of early intervention and aggressive treatment. Morrison documented hundreds of cases where dream reports provided early warning of medical complications that physical examination couldn't detect. She developed what was essentially a comprehensive classification system for Spanish flu dreams, correlating specific dream imagery with particular types of complications and treatment protocols. Dreams about drowning in dark liquids almost always predicted pneumonia within 24 to 48 hours. Dreams about confusion, lost memories, or changed meanings typically indicated developing brain inflammation. Dreams about bleeding from facial orifices usually meant hemorrhagic complications were imminent. Dreams about being unable to move or speak often preceded the kind of severe weakness and paralysis that could indicate the patient was entering the final stages of illness. She even documented cases where patients' dreams seemed to predict their own recovery or death with uncanny accuracy. Patients who dreamed about going home, returning to work, or being reunited with family members almost always recovered, even when their physical condition looked grim. Patients who dreamed about saying goodbye to loved ones, traveling to beautiful but distant places, or being visited by deceased relatives usually died within days, regardless of how stable they seemed clinically. Morrison kept meticulous records of all these cases, hoping that eventually the medical community would take her findings seriously. Her patient files from the Spanish flu pandemic, which are still preserved in medical archives, contain thousands of dream reports cross-referenced with patient outcomes, treatment protocols, and survival rates. What makes Morrison's work even more remarkable is that she was operating completely alone, without any institutional support or recognition from her peers. She was essentially conducting groundbreaking medical research while working, 16-hour days in a hospital that was completely overwhelmed by the worst pandemic in modern history, all while facing discrimination and skepticism from her male colleagues who thought women weren't smart enough to be real doctors. The really incredible part is that we now understand exactly why Morrison's dream-based diagnostic method works so well. Modern research has shown that during the early stages of respiratory infection, the brainstem, which controls breathing and monitors blood oxygen levels, starts detecting changes in lung function before there are any conscious symptoms or obvious clinical signs. This information gets processed during sleep and often emerges in dreams about drowning, suffocating, or being unable to breathe. The brain is essentially trying to alert the conscious mind to developing respiratory problems through dream imagery, often days before the problems become clinically obvious. Similarly, when viruses like Spanish flu cross the blood-brain barrier and begin causing brain inflammation, the affected neural networks can produce dreams about confusion, lost memories, or distorted reality, again, often before there are any conscious neurological symptoms that a doctor could detect through standard examination. Morrison had essentially discovered that the sleeping brain is a more sensitive diagnostic instrument than conscious physical examination or the limited laboratory tests available in 1980. She just didn't have the scientific framework to explain why her method worked. She only knew that it did work and that it was saving lives. Her approach was basically a form of very early precision medicine, where treatment decisions were based on individual patient data rather than one-size-fits-all protocols. She was using dream reports as biomarkers for disease progression, personalizing treatment based on each patient's specific risk profile as revealed through their unconscious awareness of their own condition. What's really tragic is that Morrison's insights about dream-based diagnosis were completely ignored by the medical establishment of her time, and then forgotten for nearly a century. If her methods had been taken seriously and adopted more widely during the Spanish flu pandemic, thousands of lives could potentially have been saved through earlier detection and intervention. Instead, her work was dismissed as feminine intuition rather than legitimate medical science, and she ended up being remembered more as a curiosity than as a pioneer who had figured out how to use the human unconscious as a diagnostic tool during one of the worst medical crises in history. Sometimes being ahead of your time means being right for reasons you can't possibly understand yet, and having to watch people die from problems you know how to solve, but can't convince anyone else to take seriously. After diving into those major cases, I started thinking about all the smaller, weirder instances of dream diagnosis throughout history. The ones that didn't make it into medical textbooks but are no less fascinating. And honestly, sometimes even more bizarre than the famous cases. So there's this manuscript from a 12th century convent in Germany, the convent of St. Bertha, which sounds like it should be the setting for a really twisted fairy tale that documents what the nuns called visions of affliction. Now, when medieval nuns talked about visions, they could mean anything from genuine religious experiences to what we'd probably now recognize as migraine auras, seizures, or just really intense dreams brought on by malnutrition and sleep deprivation. The Mother Superior at this convent was Sister Hildegard, and no, not the famous Hildegard of Bingen who composed music and wrote about herbal medicine, though they were contemporaries and probably would have had some fascinating conversations about the medical applications of religious visions. This was a different Hildegard, one who was apparently more interested in practical healthcare than mystical theology. Sister Hildegard had noticed that several of her nuns were having very specific types of dreams before developing what we'd now recognize as severe migraines. And I'm talking about migraines that were absolutely debilitating, the kind where you can't tolerate any light. Any sound, any movement, and you basically have to lie in a dark room for days until the pain subsides enough for you to function again. Now, medieval convents weren't exactly known for their understanding of neurological disorders. Most religious communities of the time would have interpreted severe headaches as either divine punishment for sinful thoughts, demonic possession, or possibly a sign that the afflicted person was having genuine religious visions and should be either exorcised or canonized, depending on the political climate. But Sister Hildegard was apparently more observant and less superstitious than most of her contemporaries. She started paying attention to the dreams that nuns reported in the days leading up to their headache episodes. And she found some really fascinating patterns that actually match up pretty well with what we now know about migraine auras and triggers. The nuns would dream about bright lights that hurt to look at, but not just regular bright lights. They described these dream lights as having colors that don't exist in the waking world, colors that were somehow more intense and more painful than anything they'd ever seen while awake. Some described the lights as angels too bright for mortal eyes, while others talked about the fire of heaven that burns without consuming. What's really interesting about these descriptions is that they're actually pretty accurate representations of what many migraine sufferers experience during visual auras. Modern migraine patients often report seeing lights or colors that seem unnaturally bright or intense, sometimes with geometric patterns or flashing effects that don't correspond to anything in the normal visual world. Other nuns would have dreams about being trapped in rooms where the walls were slowly closing in on their heads, creating this crushing pressure that would build and build until they woke up in panic. Some dreamed about wearing crowns made of thorns that would gradually tighten around their skulls until the pain became unbearable. Sister Hildegard documented these dream reports with the same careful attention she gave to managing the convent's finances and organizing prayer schedules. She kept detailed records of which nuns had which types of dreams when the dreams occurred and what happened to them in the following days. What she discovered was that these specific types of dreams, the painful lights, the crushing pressure, the tightening crowns, almost always preceded severe headaches by 24 to 48 hours. And I'm talking about a really high correlation rate, something like 85 to 90% accuracy in predicting which nuns would be incapacitated by headaches over the next few days. So, Sister Hildegard started using these dream reports to predict when nuns would need to be excused from their regular duties due to headaches. She'd basically create a work schedule based on who had been having crushing light dreams or crown of thorns dreams, redistributing the workload in advance so that when the predicted headaches hit, the convent could continue functioning without disruption. This was actually pretty revolutionary management for a 12th century religious institution. Most convents of the time operated on the assumption that physical illness was either God's will and therefore should be accepted without complaint, or a sign of spiritual weakness, and therefore should be overcome through prayer and penance. The idea that you could predict illness and plan around it was quite progressive. Sister Hildegard even developed what was essentially a primitive early warning system for migraine episodes. When a nun reported having one of the characteristic dreams, Hildegard would immediately move her to lighter duties. Make sure she had access to quiet, dark spaces for prayer and meditation, and sometimes even adjust her diet to avoid foods that seemed to trigger headaches in particular individuals. The really fascinating part is that these nuns lived centuries before we had any understanding of migraines as neurological events, but they developed an entire vocabulary around dream symbols that perfectly matched what we now know about migraine auras, triggers, and the prodromal phase that often precedes the actual headache. They talk about dreams where the light of God became too heavy for mortal eyes, which is honestly a pretty poetic way to describe photophobia, the light sensitivity that's characteristic of migraines. They describe dreams about Satan's hammer striking the inside of the skull, a remarkably accurate metaphor for the throbbing, pulsating pain that defines migraine headaches. Some nuns reported dreams about being unable to speak because their tongues had turned to stone, which sounds a lot like the speech difficulties and word-finding problems that some people experience during migraine episodes. Others had dreams about being lost in mazes where every path led back to the same painful dead end, which could be describing the cognitive fog and confusion that often accompanies severe headaches. One particularly detailed case in Sister Hildegard's records involves a young nun named Sister Agnes, who had been suffering from what sounds like chronic migraines for several years. Agnes would have these incredibly vivid dreams about being forced to stare directly into the sun while angels sang so loudly that the sound felt like physical blows to her head. In the dreams, Agnes would try to close her eyes or cover her ears, but she'd find that she couldn't move. She was paralyzed and forced to endure both the blinding light and the overwhelming sound until she woke up in agony. These dreams would occur every few weeks, always followed within a day or two by headaches so severe that Agnes would be unable to participate in prayers, unable to eat, and basically incapacitated for 3 or 4 days. Sister Hildegard noticed that Agnes's dreams always occurred during certain phases of the moon, and that they seemed to be triggered by specific foods served in the convent, particularly aged cheese, red wine used for communion, and certain spiced foods that were served during religious festivals. So Hildegard started experimenting with Agnes's diet and schedule, removing the suspected trigger foods and adjusting her duties to avoid stress during the lunar phases when the dreams typically occurred. The result was that Agnes's headache frequency decreased dramatically from several times per month to only occasional episodes. This was basically early trigger identification and migraine management, practiced in a 12th century German convent by a nun who had no formal medical training, but had figured out through careful observation that dreams could predict headaches and that lifestyle modifications could prevent them. The manuscript also describes how Sister Hildegard taught other nuns to recognize the warning signs in their own dreams and take preventive measures. She created what was essentially a convent-wide migraine management program, where nuns would report their dreams to designated vision interpreters who would help them identify potential headache triggers and adjust their schedules accordingly. What's really remarkable is that this system apparently worked well enough that other convents started adopting similar practices. There are references in various medieval religious texts to nuns using prophetic dreams to predict and prevent the affliction of divine light, which seems to be code for migraine management through dream analysis. Modern migraine research has actually validated many of the observations that Sister Hildegard and her nuns made 8 centuries ago. We now know that migraines often have a prodromal phase that can begin 24 to 48 hours before the actual headache, during which people may experience mood changes, food cravings, visual disturbances, and changes in sleep patterns, including more vivid or disturbing dreams. The specific dream imagery that the nuns reported, bright lights, crushing pressure, geometric patterns, corresponds pretty well to the visual and sensory auras that many migraine sufferers experience. The fact that they could use these dreams to predict headaches with such accuracy suggests that they'd identified a genuine neurological phenomenon, even though they interpreted it through the religious framework of their time. Sometimes the most sophisticated medical insights come from people who have no choice, but to pay very close attention to patterns that everyone else dismisses as irrelevant. Moving forward a few centuries to Renaissance Italy, where poisoning people was basically a professional sport among the wealthy, and honestly, if you think modern politics are toxic, you should read about what passed for normal family dynamics among Italian nobility in the 15th and 16th centuries. We're talking about an era when dinner invitations from relatives were potentially life-threatening, when hiring a food taster was considered basic personal security, and when sudden mysterious deaths were so common that they barely rated mention in the local gossip unless the victim was particularly important or died in an especially creative way. Dr. Giovanni da Viga was working right in the middle of all this Renaissance intrigue, serving as physician to several noble families in what is now northern Italy. And let me tell you, being a doctor to Italian nobility during the Renaissance was probably one of the most dangerous jobs you could possibly have, because you were constantly caught between families who were trying to poison each other, and your professional oath to do no harm could get you murdered if you interfered with the wrong assassination plot. Da Viga was actually a pretty remarkable physician for his time. He wrote some of the earliest treatises on surgical techniques, developed new methods for treating battlefield injuries, and was one of the first doctors to systematically study the effects of different poisons on the human body. Though to be fair, he had plenty of opportunities for that last bit of research, given that his patients were constantly trying to kill each other with various toxic substances. But what made Da Viga really unusual among Renaissance physicians was that he documented cases of what he called dreams of treachery, basically. He noticed that people who were being slowly poisoned would start having very specific types of nightmares, weeks or even months before showing any obvious physical symptoms of poisoning. And we're talking about slow, deliberate poisoning here, not the dramatic drink this goblet of wine and die within minutes kind of stuff you see in movies. Renaissance assassins were much more subtle than that. They'd use small doses of arsenic, mercury, or lead administered over long periods of time, gradually weakening their victims until they died of what appeared to be natural causes. It was like a really macabre version of death by 1,000 cuts, except with toxic heavy metals instead of actual cuts. The symptoms of chronic poisoning develop so gradually that victims often don't realize what's happening to them until it's too late. You start feeling a little tired, maybe lose some weight, develop some digestive problems, all things that could be attributed to stress, age, or just the normal challenges of Renaissance life, which was pretty unhealthy even under the best circumstances. But Da Viga noticed that people in the early stages of poisoning would start having remarkably consistent dream patterns that seemed to predict the specific type of toxic exposure they were experiencing. People being poisoned with arsenic would dream about eating meals where all the food turned to ash in their mouths, leaving them unable to taste anything and feeling like they were trying to eat sand or dirt. Those being slowly poisoned with mercury, which was often used because it could be mixed into cosmetics or medical treatments, would have dreams about their hair falling out in great clumps, about their teeth becoming loose and falling out, or about their fingernails turning black and dropping off. What's remarkable is that these dream symptoms often match the actual physical symptoms of mercury poisoning with uncanny accuracy, appearing in dreams weeks before the real symptoms became obvious. Lead poisoning, which was particularly common because lead was used in everything from paint to wine vessels to makeup, would typically manifest in dreams about severe stomach pain, about being unable to think clearly, or about losing the ability to move their hands and feet properly. Again, these dream symptoms corresponded almost perfectly to the actual neurological and gastrointestinal effects of chronic lead exposure. Da Viga documented this one case that still gives me chills when I think about it, both because of how it demonstrates the precision of these poisoning dreams and because of how it reveals the absolutely ruthless nature of Renaissance family politics. A duchess, let's call her Isabella, because apparently every noble woman in Renaissance Italy was named either Isabella, Lucretia, or Caterina, came to see him complaining of some vague health problems that had been developing over several months. Isabella was in her 30s, had been married to her duke for about 5 years, and by all accounts had been in excellent health until recently. But over the past few months, she'd been feeling increasingly tired and weak, had lost her appetite, and had developed what she described as a persistent metallic taste in her mouth that made eating unpleasant. Her physical examination revealed nothing obviously wrong, no fever, no visible signs of illness, no obvious abnormalities that Daviga could detect with the diagnostic tools available in the 16th century. By Renaissance medical standards, Isabella seemed like a reasonably healthy woman who might be suffering from what they'd probably call melancholic humors, or maybe just the stress of managing a noble household. But Daviga had learned to ask all his patients about their dreams, because he'd noticed that dream reports often contained medically relevant information that physical examination missed. When he asked Isabella about her recent dreams, her response immediately made him suspect that something much more sinister was happening. For the past several weeks, Isabella had been having the same disturbing dream almost every night. In the dream, she was sitting down to dinner with her husband and his family, eating what appeared to be a perfectly normal meal. But every time she tried to drink anything, wine, water, even soup, the liquid would turn into sand the moment it touched her lips. She'd try to swallow, but instead of liquid going down her throat, she'd feel like she was swallowing handfuls of gritty sand that would scratch and burn all the way down. She'd try to spit it out, but more sand would keep pouring into her mouth from the cup or bowl, no matter how much she tried to get rid of it. The dream was so vivid and so consistently terrifying that Isabella had started avoiding meals with her husband's family, claiming she wasn't feeling well or had already eaten. She'd taken to eating alone in her chambers, and even then, she'd sometimes find herself hesitating before drinking anything because the dream memory of sand burning her throat was so realistic. Now, most Renaissance physicians would have heard this dream report and probably attributed it to anxiety about her marriage or maybe some kind of spiritual distress requiring confession and penance. But Daviga had seen enough cases of slow poisoning to recognize the pattern, and Isabella's dream about liquids turning to sand immediately made him suspect arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was one of the most popular poisons among Renaissance nobles because it was relatively easy to obtain, could be mixed into food or drink without being detected, and cause symptoms that could easily be mistaken for natural illness. It also had the advantage of being cumulative. Small doses over time would gradually build up in the victim system until they reached toxic levels. But Daviga faced a delicate problem. He couldn't just accuse Isabella's husband of trying to poison her without solid evidence, because making false accusations against a duke was a good way to end up mysteriously dead yourself. Renaissance nobles didn't take kindly to suggestions that they were trying to murder their wives, even when they actually were. So Daviga did something quite clever and remarkably dangerous. He secretly arranged to test samples of Isabella's food and drink for the presence of arsenic. This involved bribing servants, sneaking around the duke's palace, and basically conducting a criminal investigation while pretending to provide routine medical care. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Several of the foods and drinks that were regularly served to Isabella contained measurable amounts of arsenic. Not enough to cause immediate symptoms, but definitely enough to cause gradual poisoning over a period of months. Daviga was now in an incredibly dangerous position. He knew that Isabella was being slowly murdered, probably by her own husband who wanted to inherit her lands and dowry. But he couldn't openly accuse the duke without putting his own life at risk, and he couldn't just tell Isabella what was happening because she might confront her husband and get them both killed. So Daviga came up with a solution that was both medically sound and politically safe. He told Isabella that her dream suggested she had developed a sensitivity to certain foods and drinks that was causing her health problems, and that she should avoid eating or drinking anything that hadn't been prepared by her own personal servants using ingredients she'd personally selected. He also suggested that Isabella might benefit from spending some time away from the palace, perhaps visiting relatives in a different city where the air was more beneficial to her delicate constitution. Basically, he was telling her to get away from her husband and stop eating food that he had access to, without actually saying that her husband was trying to kill her. Isabella followed Daviga's advice, probably thinking she was getting treatment for some kind of food sensitivity or digestive disorder. She started having all her meals prepared by servants who reported directly to her rather than to her husband, using ingredients that she purchased herself from trusted sources. Within a few weeks, both Isabella's physical symptoms and her dreams about sand began to improve dramatically. The metallic taste in her mouth disappeared, her appetite returned, her energy levels increased, and she stopped having the terrifying dreams about trying to drink sand. Daviga quietly monitored her progress over the following months, and Isabella made a complete recovery from what had obviously been chronic arsenic poisoning. She never found out that her husband had been trying to kill her, and Daviga never explicitly told her what had really been happening, but his intervention had almost certainly saved her life. What makes this case particularly interesting is that Daviga essentially used Isabella's dreams as an early detection system for poisoning, then developed a treatment plan that addressed the real problem without putting anyone at risk of political retaliation. He was practicing a form of covert forensic medicine, using dream analysis to detect crimes that couldn't be investigated through normal channels. Daviga documented dozens of similar cases where he used dream reports to identify victims of slow poisoning and then developed creative interventions to protect them without directly confronting their would-be murderers. He essentially became Renaissance Italy's version of a medical detective, using people's nightmares to solve cases of attempted murder. What's really remarkable is that Daviga essentially developed a method for detecting poisoning before it became fatal, just by listening to people's dreams and understanding what the symbolic imagery might represent in terms of actual toxic exposure. In an era where political assassination by poison was incredibly common, this was literally a life-saving diagnostic skill. Jumping across the Atlantic to colonial America, where giving birth was essentially a life-or-death gamble that women had to take if they wanted to continue the human species. And honestly, when you read about what passed for obstetric care in the 1700s, it's amazing that anyone survived childbirth at all. We're talking about an era when the leading cause of death for women was pregnancy-related complications, when most babies didn't survive their first year, and when the closest thing to prenatal care was making sure pregnant women didn't lift anything heavier than a water bucket and maybe praying really hard that nothing went wrong. But here's the thing about colonial America. Women weren't allowed to be doctors, because the male medical establishment was convinced that female brains were too small and too emotionally unstable to handle the complexities of medical knowledge. So instead, communities relied on midwives, women who had learned their skills through apprenticeship, observation, and generations of passed down knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth. And these midwives, despite having no formal medical training and no access to medical schools or textbooks, were often significantly more successful at helping women through pregnancy and childbirth than the few male doctors who occasionally got involved in obstetric care. Partly this was because midwives actually understood female anatomy and physiology, while male doctors were often working from theoretical knowledge that was both limited and frequently wrong. But mostly, it was because midwives had developed their own sophisticated systems for monitoring pregnancy and predicting complications, based on careful observation of women's experiences and symptoms over decades of practice. And one of the most fascinating aspects of colonial midwifery was how these women used dream reports as diagnostic tools for assessing pregnancy health and predicting potential problems. Granny Sarah Thompson was a midwife working in colonial Virginia during the 1760s, and her handwritten records, which still exist in various historical archives, though her spelling was pretty creative and her handwriting looks like it was done during an earthquake, document dozens of cases where women's dreams accurately predicted pregnancy outcomes weeks or even months before any physical symptoms appeared. Now, Granny Sarah wasn't her real name. That was just what everyone called her because she'd been delivering babies in the same Virginia County for over 40 years and had probably attended the births of half the population. Her actual name was Sarah Thompson, and she'd learned midwifery from her own mother, who had learned it from her mother, creating an unbroken chain of female medical knowledge that stretched back generations. What made Granny Sarah unusual among colonial midwives was that she kept detailed written records of her cases, including not just the medical details of pregnancies and births, but also the dreams and premonitions that pregnant women reported to her. Most midwives of the time relied on oral tradition and memory, but Granny Sarah had somehow learned to read and write, which was pretty rare for women in colonial America, and she documented everything with obsessive thoroughness. Her records show that she'd identified specific patterns in pregnant women's dreams that could predict not just pregnancy itself, but also the likely course of the pregnancy and potential complications that might arise during labor and delivery. And I'm talking about remarkably specific and accurate predictions, often made months before any physical evidence supported her assessments. For instance, Granny Sarah documented that women in the very early stages of pregnancy, often before they'd even missed their first monthly cycle, would frequently dream about finding birds' nests with eggs in them. But the specific details of these nest dreams seemed to predict different aspects of the pregnancy outcome. Dreams about finding nests with healthy, intact eggs usually indicated normal, healthy pregnancies that would proceed without major complications. Dreams about nests with cracked or broken eggs often predicted early miscarriage or pregnancy loss. Dreams about nests that were too high to reach typically meant the woman would have difficulty conceiving or maintaining the pregnancy. But what's really fascinating is how specific some of these predictive dreams could be. Granny Sarah documented cases where women dreamed about finding nests with specific numbers of eggs, and those numbers often corresponded to details about the pregnancy, the number of months until delivery, the number of children they would eventually have, or even the number of pregnancy complications they might experience. One case that particularly impressed Granny Sarah involved a young woman named Martha Whitfield, who came to her suspecting she might be pregnant but wasn't sure. Martha had been married for about 2 years without conceiving, which was starting to cause concern in a society where a woman's primary value was her ability to produce children. When Granny Sarah asked Martha about her recent dreams, which was apparently part of her standard consultation process, Martha described having a recurring dream about planting seeds in a garden. In the dream, she would plant a whole row of seeds, but only one would grow into a healthy plant. The other seeds would either fail to sprout at all, or would grow for a while and then wither and die. Based on this dream alone, Granny Sarah predicted that Martha was indeed pregnant, but that this pregnancy would be preceded and followed by several miscarriages. She told Martha to expect to lose this pregnancy within the first few months, but also predicted that she would eventually have one healthy child after several more pregnancy losses. Sure enough, Martha miscarried about 6 weeks later, which confirmed the first part of Granny Sarah's prediction. Over the next few years, Martha had several more early miscarriages, exactly as the dream had suggested. But eventually, she did carry one pregnancy to term and delivered a healthy baby, completing the pattern that her seed-planting dream had predicted years earlier. But Granny Sarah's dream analysis wasn't limited to predicting pregnancy outcomes. She also used women's dreams to predict labor and delivery complications with remarkable accuracy. Dreams about storms or rough water often indicated that the woman would have a difficult, prolonged labor. Dreams about the baby being born with wings, extra limbs, or other unusual features sometimes predicted birth defects or developmental problems. Dreams about the baby being born already walking, talking, or having adult teeth often meant premature labor was likely. Dreams about giving birth to animals instead of babies usually indicated some kind of serious complication during delivery that could endanger both mother and child. Granny Sarah had this one case that perfectly demonstrates how specific and medically accurate these predictive dreams could be. A woman in her 7th month of pregnancy, let's call her Rebecca, because that was apparently the second most popular name for colonial women after Mary, started having recurring dreams about giving birth to a baby that was already walking and talking. In these dreams, Rebecca would go into labor normally, but when the baby was born, it would immediately stand up on the birthing bed and start having adult conversations with the midwife and family members. The dream baby would talk about being eager to get started with life, about having important work to do, and about not wanting to waste time with the usual helpless infant stage. When Rebecca described these dreams to Granny Sarah, the midwife immediately put her on strict bed rest and started preparing for an early delivery. This was pretty radical medical advice for the 1760s, when most pregnancy management consisted of continue working until labor starts, then try not to die. But Granny Sarah had learned to trust these specific types of dreams because they almost always indicated that the baby was going to be born prematurely. The dream imagery of a baby being ready for adult life seemed to correspond to pregnancies, where the fetus was developing faster than normal or where labor would begin before the full term was completed. Sure enough, Rebecca went into labor about 6 weeks earlier than expected, delivering a baby who was small but otherwise healthy. And because Granny Sarah had predicted the premature birth based on the dream reports, she'd been able to prepare for the early delivery and provide the kind of immediate care that probably saved both mother and baby. What's really remarkable about colonial midwifery is how these women managed to develop such sophisticated diagnostic techniques using nothing but observation, experience, and careful attention to patterns that male doctors completely ignored. They didn't understand hormones, fetal development, or the physiological processes underlying pregnancy, but they understood that pregnant women's dreams often contained remarkably accurate information about their pregnancies. Granny Sarah and other colonial midwives had essentially crowdsourced a prenatal diagnostic system based entirely on dream reports and systematic observation of outcomes over decades of practice. They created an informal but highly effective early warning system for pregnancy complications, using the unconscious awareness that pregnant women seem to have about their own conditions. Modern obstetric research has actually validated many of the observations that colonial midwives made about pregnancy dreams. We now know that hormonal changes during pregnancy can significantly affect dream content and dream recall, and that women often do have unusually vivid or prophetic dreams during pregnancy that seem to reflect their unconscious awareness of their physical condition. The stress hormones and other chemical changes that occur during high-risk pregnancies can definitely influence brain chemistry in ways that affect dreaming, and women experiencing pregnancy complications often report more disturbing or more medically specific dreams than women with normal pregnancies. Sometimes the most sophisticated medical knowledge comes from people who aren't allowed to call themselves doctors, but have been forced to develop their own systems for keeping people alive. So after exploring all these cases, you're probably wondering, how the hell did any of this actually work? I mean, we're talking about people using dreams to diagnose everything from cancer to plague, often with remarkable accuracy, long before we understood anything about how the brain and body actually communicate with each other. It's like they figured out how to use the most mysterious aspect of human consciousness as a medical diagnostic tool without having any clue about neuroscience, psychology, or even basic anatomy. The answer, it turns out, is actually pretty fascinating from a modern scientific perspective, and it reveals just how much our ancestors understood about the human condition even when they had completely wrong explanations for why their methods worked. Let's start with the ancient world, because they actually had some surprisingly sophisticated ideas about the connection between dreams and physical health, even though their theoretical framework was based on gods, spirits, and various supernatural forces that we now know don't exist. The Egyptians, for instance, believed that during sleep, something they called the Ka, which was basically your spiritual double, would separate from your physical body and travel around, examining you for signs of illness, injury, or spiritual contamination. Now, obviously, we don't believe in soul travel anymore. At least most of us don't. But the Egyptians were onto something genuinely important. They recognized that the sleeping mind has access to information about the body's condition that the conscious mind completely misses. They just attributed this phenomenon to supernatural causes because they didn't have any other way to explain it. The Egyptian concept of the Ka was actually pretty sophisticated when you think about it. They believed that this spiritual double would spend the night conducting what was essentially a comprehensive medical examination of your body, checking for problems, monitoring organ function, and assessing your overall health status. If the Ka discovered anything concerning, it would report back through dreams, using symbolic imagery that the conscious mind could interpret as warnings about future illness. What's remarkable is that this ancient Egyptian model of dream-based health Monitoring is actually pretty close to what we now understand about how the brain processes bodily information during sleep. During the deeper stages of sleep, your brain does conduct something like a systematic patrol of your body's condition, processing sensory information it collected during the day but didn't consciously register. Subtle changes in how your body feels, minor pain signals you ignored while awake, early signs of infection or inflammation, hormonal fluctuations, changes in organ function. All of this information gets sorted through and analyzed during sleep. And much of this unconscious health monitoring can emerge in dream content, sometimes days or weeks before there are any obvious physical symptoms. The Greeks took the Egyptian ideas about dream-based health diagnosis and turned them into something resembling systematic medical research. The whole Asclepios temple system we talked about earlier wasn't just religious ritual. It was actually a pretty sophisticated clinical research program that collected data on thousands of cases over centuries. The Greeks were obsessive record keepers, and they treated dream diagnosis like an early form of evidence-based medicine. They documented specific dream symbols, cross-referenced them with patient outcomes, and developed what was essentially a comprehensive database of dream disease correlations. Dreams about being attacked by animals typically preceded fever-related illnesses. Dreams about drowning or being buried alive usually appeared before respiratory problems. Dreams about being cut or wounded frequently came before the discovery of tumors or internal injuries. But what made the Greek approach really remarkable was that they didn't just collect this information. They actually tested their theories and refined their methods based on outcomes. If a particular type of dream consistently failed to predict the expected illness, they'd revise their interpretation system. If a new pattern emerged in the data, they'd incorporate it into their diagnostic protocols. The medieval Islamic scholars took Greek dream medicine and made it genuinely scientific, applying the same rigorous methodology they used for mathematics, chemistry, and astronomy. Physicians like Al-Razi approached dream diagnosis with systematic observation, controlled conditions, and careful documentation of results over long periods of time. Islamic medicine during the medieval period was incredibly advanced compared to what was happening in Europe at the same time. While European doctors were still attributing illness to demonic possession and treating everything with bloodletting, Islamic physicians were conducting actual medical research, developing surgical techniques, and creating the first real hospitals with specialized wards and medical schools. When Islamic doctors like Al-Razi studied dream-based diagnosis, they brought this same scientific rigor to understanding how and why it worked. Al-Razi developed sophisticated theories about what he called the body's hidden awareness, the idea that physical organs could somehow communicate information about their condition to the sleeping mind before conscious symptoms appeared. He theorized that the heart, lungs, liver, and other organs had their own ways of speaking through dreams when something was wrong. People with developing heart problems often dreamed about being chased or having their chest crushed because their hearts were already working harder than normal even before they developed conscious symptoms. People with liver problems frequently dreamed about bitter tastes or yellow colors, which we now know correlates with early signs of jaundice and liver dysfunction. The Islamic physicians also made the crucial connection between emotional state and physical health, recognizing that psychological stress could manifest as physical illness, and that dreams often reflected both emotional and physical problems simultaneously. This was revolutionary thinking for the medieval period, the idea that mind and body were intimately connected and that both could be monitored through dream content. The Victorian era is, well, it's complicated when it comes to dream medicine. On one hand, you had doctors like McNish making genuinely useful observations about the connection between dreams and physical health. On the other hand, you had a lot of complete medical nonsense dressed up as scientific theory, much of it based on Victorian assumptions about gender, race, and social class that were both wrong and harmful. Victorian doctors were obsessed with the idea that dreams could reveal moral character and predict future behavior. They thought that people who had violent dreams were naturally criminal, that women who had sexual dreams were suffering from hysteria, and that children who had nightmares were destined to become mentally ill. Most of this was obviously garbage based on Victorian prejudices rather than actual medical observation. But hidden within all the Victorian pseudoscience were some genuine insights about how dreams could serve as diagnostic tools. Victorian physicians noticed that people with certain types of brain injuries had very specific changes in their dream patterns. They documented that patients with depression often had dreams that were unusually vivid and frequently involved themes of death, burial, or being trapped. They also made important connections between physical pain and dream content, noting that people with chronic pain often had dreams where they were being tortured, attacked, or injured in ways that matched their waking pain patterns. Victorian doctors didn't understand the neurological mechanisms behind these observations, but they recognized that dream reports often contained medically relevant information. What the Victorians got right, almost by accident, was the idea that dreams could serve as a kind of diagnostic interview with the unconscious mind. They developed the concept that the sleeping brain might have access to information about the body's condition that conscious examination couldn't detect, and that this information could be accessed through systematic dream analysis. So, what do we actually know now about why dream-based diagnosis sometimes worked? Modern neuroscience and sleep medicine have revealed that the brain is constantly monitoring the body's condition, even during sleep, especially during sleep. During the deeper stages of sleep, your brain processes sensory information from throughout the body, looking for signs of infection, inflammation, injury, hormonal changes, or other problems. This monitoring happens below the level of conscious awareness, but it can definitely influence dream content. If your immune system is fighting off an early infection, this information gets processed during sleep and might emerge as dreams about being attacked, invaded, or overwhelmed by hostile forces. If you're developing heart problems, the brain's awareness of changing cardiac function might manifest as dreams about being chased, crushed, or unable to breathe. We also understand now that the brain regions responsible for processing physical sensations are highly active during REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs. This means that subtle changes in how your body feels, changes you might not consciously notice during waking hours, can be amplified and incorporated into dream narratives. There's also the phenomenon of prodromal dreams, dreams that occur during the early stages of illness, before conscious symptoms appear. People with migraines often dream about bright lights or crushing sensations, 24 to 48 hours before a headache starts. People developing heart problems frequently have dreams about being chased or about their chest being compressed. Cancer patients sometimes report dreams about being invaded, eaten, or colonized by parasites or creatures months before their tumors are large enough to be detected through standard examination. The accuracy rate isn't perfect. Dreams are influenced by lots of factors, including stress, memories, medications, and random neural activity. But the correlation between certain types of dreams and specific health conditions is strong enough that some modern doctors are starting to take dream reports seriously as potentially valuable diagnostic information. Turns out those ancient dream doctors weren't just making lucky guesses. They were tapping into a very real phenomenon that connects our sleeping minds to our body's hidden awareness of their own condition. Before we drift off into our own dreams tonight, let me share a few lesser-known stories about dream diagnosis that most people have never heard. The kinds of cases that were too strange, too specific, or too politically inconvenient to make it into official medical records, but that revealed just how deep and weird the connection between dreams and physical health really goes. The Civil War surgeon's dream journal during the American Civil War. There was this Union surgeon named Dr. William Hammond, who kept what might be the most macabre and fascinating medical journal in American history. Hammond was working in field hospitals across Virginia and Pennsylvania, dealing with traumatic injuries, amputations, and infections under conditions that would make modern emergency rooms look like luxury spas. Field surgery during the Civil War was basically controlled butchery performed in tents, barns, and sometimes just out in the open air, with minimal anesthesia, no understanding of sterile technique, and survival rates that were frankly horrifying. Surgeons like Hammond were essentially making life and death decisions based on gut instinct and limited experience. trying to figure out which wounded soldiers were worth spending precious time and resources on. But Hammond noticed something that other field surgeons were ignoring: soldiers' dreams in the hours and days following surgery often predicted with remarkable accuracy which wounds would heal properly and which would develop gangrene, infection, or other fatal complications. Soldiers who dreamed about their wounds being attacked by insects, worms, or small animals almost always developed gangrene within 24 to 48 hours, regardless of how clean the wound looked immediately after surgery. Hammond documented case after case where soldiers would report dreams about maggots eating their amputated limbs, or about rats gnawing at their surgical sites, and sure enough, those wounds would become infected and start showing signs of tissue death within days. But soldiers who dreamed about their wounds being tended by angels, deceased family members, or beautiful women in white clothing usually healed without major complications, even when their injuries seemed more severe than those of soldiers who had the insect dreams. Hammond started using these dream reports to prioritize his limited medical supplies and attention. Soldiers reporting insect dreams got immediate aggressive treatment for infection, cleaning with whatever antiseptics were available, frequent dressing changes, and sometimes re-amputation if the infection was spreading. His patient survival rate became significantly higher than other field surgeons working under similar conditions. The really eerie part of Hammond's journal is his documentation of what he called death dreams. Soldiers who dreamed about going home, seeing their families, or returning to their farms almost always recovered from their injuries, even when their conditions looked hopeless. But soldiers who dreamed about dying, about being visited by dead comrades, or about traveling to beautiful but distant places usually didn't survive, regardless of how minor their wounds appeared. Hammond kept meticulous records of these correlations, cross-referencing dream reports with patient outcomes over months of battlefield medicine. His notes reveal a man who was genuinely trying to understand a phenomenon that defied everything he'd learned in medical school, but that was saving lives in ways he couldn't explain. The plague dreams of medieval children in 14th century Florence during the Black Death outbreak that killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. There are records of something so strange that most historians have dismissed it as medieval superstition. Children having prophetic dreams about which neighborhoods the plague would hit next. These weren't just anxiety dreams about disease and death, which would have been completely understandable given that children were watching their parents. Siblings and friends die around them in horrifying numbers. These were very specific dreams about dark clouds, shadows, or swarms of insects descending on particular streets, districts, or even individual buildings. The city authorities, desperate for any kind of early warning system that might help them control the outbreak, actually started documenting these children's dreams and using them to predict where plague cases would appear next. According to the surviving records, children would dream about the shadow of death moving towards specific parts of the city, and plague outbreaks would follow those predicted patterns about 70% of the time. One particularly well-documented case involves a 7-year-old girl named Katerina, whose dreams about plague movements were so consistently accurate that city officials assigned a scribe to record her nightly visions. Katerina would dream about seeing a massive black bird flying over Florence, landing on specific buildings, and then people in those buildings would start dying within days. The city began evacuating areas that Katerina and other children had identified in their dreams, moving healthy residents to temporary camps outside the city walls. This early warning system, based entirely on children's dreams, may have saved hundreds of lives during one of the worst pandemic outbreaks in human history. Nobody knows how this worked. Maybe children's developing brains were more sensitive to environmental cues that adults missed, subtle changes in animal behavior, air quality, or other factors that might indicate where disease was spreading. Maybe they were unconsciously picking up on patterns in how the plague moved through the city's population and trade routes. Or maybe in the chaos and terror of medieval pandemic, the world became strange enough that the normal boundaries between conscious and unconscious, awareness broke down in ways we can't understand. The dreams of the dying throughout history, hospice workers, family members, and physicians have documented that people in their final days or weeks often have very specific types of dreams that seem to predict exactly when they'll die, regardless of their apparent physical condition. These aren't anxiety dreams about death. They're often surprisingly peaceful dreams about deceased relatives coming to visit, about traveling to beautiful places, or about completing important tasks. What's remarkable is the precision of the timing. People who have these visitation dreams where dead family members appear to them and seem to be preparing them for death, usually die within 24 to 48 hours, even when their medical condition doesn't suggest that death is imminent. Medieval records from monasteries and hospitals document hundreds of cases where patients would report dreams about being visited by deceased loved ones who would tell them it was time to come home or time to rest. The patients would often wake from these dreams with a sense of peace and acceptance, and they'd typically die quietly within a day or two. Victorian-era hospice records are full of similar cases. Patients with terminal illnesses would report dreams about deceased spouses, parents, or children coming to escort them to a beautiful garden or a place of rest. These dreams were so consistently followed by death that hospice workers learned to notify family members when patients reported visitation dreams, because it usually meant they had less than 48 hours remaining. Modern hospice nurses still document this phenomenon. Patients will report dreams about dead relatives, about traveling to peaceful places, or about finishing important work, and these dreams are still remarkably accurate predictors of imminent death. The timing correlation is so strong that many hospice facilities train their staff to recognize these dream patterns as part of the dying process. The pregnancy prophets of ancient Rome Roman, midwives developed what might be the most sophisticated system of dream-based pregnancy diagnosis in the ancient world. They believed that the spirits of unborn children could communicate with their mothers through dreams, providing information about the pregnancy's progress, the baby's health, and potential complications during birth. Roman women would report dreams about meeting their unborn children, who would appear as adults and provide specific information about when they wanted to be born, what their names should be, and what kinds of lives they intended to live. Midwives used these dream reports to predict due dates, identify potential birth complications, and even determine the sex of unborn children. One particularly fascinating case from Roman medical records involves a woman who dreamed that her unborn child appeared to her as a young soldier, telling her that he needed to be born during a particular phase of the moon because he was destined to serve in the army and needed to be born under the right astrological conditions for military success. The midwife adjusted the woman's care based on this dream, using herbal treatments to encourage labor during the predicted time period. The baby was indeed born during the specified lunar phase, and according to the records, he did eventually become a successful military officer, exactly as the dream had predicted. Sometimes the most profound medical mysteries aren't about healing or curing. They're about the strange ways that the human mind seems to know things it couldn't possibly know, and the mysterious dignity with which consciousness prepares itself for the transitions that define our existence. If you're somehow still awake at this point, well, I'm honestly impressed and also a little concerned about your sleep habits. That's a lot of bizarre medical history for one night. And if you've made it through 2 hours of stories about doctors using dreams to diagnose everything from plague to pregnancy complications, you either have really good insomnia or you're just genuinely fascinated by the weird ways that human consciousness has always been trying to tell us things we're not quite ready to hear. But I hope these stories have given you something interesting to think about as you drift off tonight. There's something both comforting and slightly unsettling about the idea that our sleeping minds might be more aware of our bodies than our waking consciousness. That dreams might actually be trying to tell us something important about our health, our relationships, our futures, or just the strange condition of being human in a world that's always been weirder than we pretend it is. Think about it. For thousands of years, people have been having dreams that seem to predict illness, reveal hidden problems, or prepare them for changes they couldn't consciously anticipate. Ancient Greek priests, medieval Islamic physicians, Victorian doctors, Civil War surgeons, Renaissance poison detectives, all of these people figured out through careful observation and probably a lot of trial and error, that there's something valuable hidden in the strange symbolic language that our minds speak when we're unconscious. Maybe it's just that our brains are constantly monitoring our bodies in ways we're not aware of, processing information about infections, hormonal changes, developing problems, and then translating that awareness into the bizarre imagery of dreams. Maybe it's something more mysterious than that. Honestly, I don't think anyone really knows for sure, and that's part of what makes it so fascinating. Next time you have a really vivid or strange dream, maybe pay attention to what it might be saying. I'm not suggesting you start diagnosing yourself based on your nightmares. Please don't do that, because I'm not a doctor and this is just entertainment, not medical advice. But there's something beautiful about the possibility that even in sleep, some part of us is still looking out for our well-being, still trying to communicate important information, still connecting us to the long chain of human consciousness that stretches back through all these centuries of people trying to understand what their dreams meant. I'd love to hear where you're falling asleep tonight. And if you've ever had a dream that seemed to predict something about your health, your life, or just something weird that happened later, drop a comment below and let me know. Maybe your story will make it into a future episode, or maybe it'll just become part of this strange ongoing conversation about the mysterious things that happen when we close our eyes and let our minds wander into places we can't control. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to these bizarre historical tales. We'll be back next week with more strange dream stories that will hopefully help you drift off into your own mysterious dream world, where maybe you'll meet some ancient Greek healing gods or Victorian doctors with questionable theories, or maybe just have perfectly normal dreams about forgetting to wear pants to work. Sleep well, and who knows? Maybe tonight you'll dream about visiting one of those ancient temple healing centers, or having a conversation with Al-Razi about the medical significance of nightmares, or just drifting peacefully through your own unconscious awareness of whatever your body and mind are trying to tell you. See you in your dreams.